Physical products have a cost structure most people understand intuitively. Make 1 unit, pay for 1 unit. Sell 1 unit, recoup 1 unit's cost. Scale the business, scale the costs proportionally. More inventory, more storage, more shipping, more handling, more of everything that makes the physical product exist and reach the customer. Digital products don't work that way. And that structural difference, the way costs behave as volume grows, is what makes digital products economically distinct from anything physical. The concept is called marginal cost, the cost of producing one additional unit. For a physical product, marginal cost is real and ongoing. Each additional unit requires materials, requires production time, requires packaging and delivery. These costs don't disappear at scale. They might decrease slightly through efficiency, but they never approach zero. The 1,000th unit costs roughly what the first did, maybe a little less, but still something. For a digital product, the marginal cost approaches zero. Once the product exists, the ebook, the course, the software, the template, selling the next copy costs almost nothing. Server costs, bandwidth, payment processing, fractions of what the physical equivalent would cost. The product is created once. The cost of creating it is fixed. Every sale after that adds revenue against a cost base that barely moves. The financial implications of this compound significantly over volume. A physical product business that grows from 100 units to 10,000 units has to scale its cost structure proportionally. A digital product business that grows from 100 sales to 10,000 scales its revenue, while its costs grow marginally. The margin expands with scale, not because the business became more efficient, because the fundamental economics are structured differently. At 100 sales, the fixed cost of creating the product represents a significant cost per unit. At 10,000 sales, that same fixed cost is distributed across 10,000 units. The cost per unit has dropped dramatically. The margin per unit has expanded dramatically. The product got more profitable not because anything changed, because scale does something different to a zero marginal cost model than it does to a physical one. This is why digital product businesses can achieve margins that physical product businesses rarely see. Not through superior operations, not through superior negotiating, through the structural economics of a cost model that doesn't scale with revenue. A software company with 10 million in revenue and 2 million in costs is achieving margins that a manufacturing company at the same revenue level almost certainly can't match. Not because the software company is better run, because their cost structure behaves differently as they grow. For someone building a side income stream or a small business, the implications are direct. A digital product created once can be sold without meaningful additional cost per unit. Not infinitely, not without effort to market and distribute, not without ongoing maintenance and improvement. But the fundamental constraint that limits physical product businesses, the cost that arrives with every sale, is structurally absent. Which changes the question from how do I afford to scale to how do I build the distribution that puts the product in front of enough people? The economics work at scale. The work is earning the scale.
Most content talks at you. This one sits with you. If that difference stood out, if this felt real instead of loud, like the video, subscribe. This channel is built for people who notice patterns. A digital product isn't just a product. It's an asset. And assets behave differently from products in one important respect. They compound. Not always, not automatically, but through specific mechanisms that physical products don't have, that change the value of the thing over time rather than depleting it. The first compounding mechanism is distribution. A physical product sitting on a shelf isn't building anything while it waits to be sold. A digital product published online is accumulating something even when it isn't actively being sold. Search presence, backlinks, reviews, social mentions, references from other creators and publishers. Each of these increases the likelihood that the next person searching for a solution to the problem the product solves will find it. The product gets more discoverable over time, not because of additional investment, because of the accumulation of digital footprint that builds passively around a product that has existed long enough to develop one. The second compounding mechanism is trust. A product that has been purchased by 1,000 customers and reviewed positively by hundreds of them is structurally different from a new product with no track record. The social proof accumulates. The credibility builds. The trust that makes the next customer's decision easier is a function of every previous customer who bought and validated the product. That trust doesn't depreciate the way physical inventory does. A product with 500 five-star reviews doesn't need those reviews refreshed. They continue persuading new customers long after they were written. The asset accumulates social proof that compounds its conversion rate, making each new potential customer more likely to buy than the ones who came before. The third compounding mechanism is the relationship between products. A creator who publishes one digital product has a customer base. A creator who publishes 5 has a catalog. And a catalog behaves differently from a single product. Each product introduces customers to the creator's broader work. Each satisfied customer is a potential buyer of the next product. The revenue from the catalog grows faster than the revenue from any single product because each new product benefits from the audience and trust that the previous products built. The products compound off each other. The audience built by one becomes the launch pad for the next. Most creators and small business owners think about digital products in terms of the launch. How many sales at launch? What the first week looks like? Whether the initial revenue justifies the effort. But digital products that are built correctly, that solve a real problem, that are positioned in a searchable category, that are supported by a growing body of trust, don't peak at launch. They grow after launch. As distribution compounds, as trust accumulates, as the catalog expands around them. The launch is just the beginning of the asset's productive life, not the moment its value is determined.
The economics of digital products are real. Zero marginal cost, compounding distribution, accumulating trust, catalog leverage. These aren't theoretical properties. They're the structural mechanics behind some of the most scalable income models available to independent creators and small businesses. But they're not automatic, and they're not universal. Digital products have real limitations, structural ones, that determine whether the economics actually materialize or remain theoretical. The first structural limitation is discoverability. Zero marginal cost only produces leverage if there are customers to sell to. And finding customers for a digital product requires solving a discoverability problem that many creators underestimate. The product exists on the internet, alongside millions of other digital products solving similar problems. Getting in front of the right buyers requires distribution, search presence, audience, platform, referrals. That takes significant time and effort to build. The economics of the product are only accessible after the discoverability problem is solved, and solving it is often the hardest part of the entire model. The second limitation is commoditization. Digital products can be copied, replicated, or undercut in ways physical products often can't. A methodology that was novel in one year may be freely available in blog posts and YouTube videos the next. A template that commanded a premium when it was unique becomes one of hundreds of similar options as the category matures. The economics of scarcity don't apply to digital products in the same way, which means the products that maintain their value are the ones tied to a specific creator's perspective, methodology, or ongoing relationship with the buyer, not just to the information itself. Information commoditizes. Perspective and relationship are harder to replicate. The third limitation is trust. Digital products are purchased before they're experienced. The buyer can't hold the product, test it, or verify its quality before they decide to pay, which means trust is the primary variable in the purchase decision, not the product itself. A creator with no established reputation faces a significant trust barrier that a physical product in a store doesn't face in the same way. The buyer can see the physical product. They can evaluate it before purchasing. They rely on the brand reputation, but they have tangible information. The digital product buyer relies almost entirely on the creator's reputation, the social proof around the product, and the signals of credibility the creator has built through content and presence. These limitations don't invalidate the model. They contextualize it. The digital product economics work, but they work for creators who have solved the discoverability problem, who have built or are building trust, who are positioned in a way that differentiates them from the commoditized version of their category. Without those elements, the zero marginal cost and the compounding distribution remain theoretical. The economics are available. The access to them is earned through the distribution, the trust, and the differentiation that make a buyer choose your product over the countless alternatives. If this shifted something for you, subscribe. Like this if it clarified something. Most side hustles are built on manual execution. The owner does the work, every piece of it, every client interaction, every deliverable, every administrative task surrounding the delivery. And that's appropriate in the beginning. The early stage is about understanding the work, what the client needs, what the delivery requires, what the process actually looks like when it's done well. But what starts as necessary participation often stays as permanent participation. Not because the owner couldn't delegate or automate, because they never stopped to examine which parts of the work required them specifically and which parts were just execution that happened to be done by them. Every manual task has two properties: how much time it takes and whether it requires the owner's specific judgment. Some tasks are high judgment, the strategic decision, the client relationship management, the creative direction, the quality assessment. These tasks benefit from the owner's presence. They produce better outcomes because the owner specifically is doing them. Other tasks are low judgment: the scheduling, the follow-up email, the invoice generation, the file organization, the repetitive parts of the delivery that follow the same pattern every time. These tasks don't benefit from the owner's presence. They just require presence because nobody has set up the system that does them without it. Every hour spent on low-judgment tasks is an hour not spent on high-judgment ones, not just in terms of productivity, in terms of what gets built. The owner who spends their available hours on administrative execution has less capacity to develop the product, build the relationship, improve the delivery, or systematize the process. The hustle stays exactly as it is because the owner's hours are consumed keeping it running rather than building it into something that runs differently. This is the core cost of a hustle without systems. Not just the wasted time on individual tasks, the opportunity cost of what those hours could have built instead. The ceiling created by manual execution isn't obvious until it's been hit. In the early stage, the owner has capacity. Not all hours are consumed. There's room to take more clients, produce more deliverables, grow incrementally. As the hustle grows, the available capacity fills. More clients, more deliverables, more administrative overheads surrounding each. And eventually, the owner is at capacity. Every available hour is committed. The hustle is at its maximum output given the structure it's running on. Not a market ceiling, not a capability ceiling, a time ceiling. The hustle can't grow further without the owner working more hours, which aren't available, or without changing the structure. Changing the structure is what systems do, not by removing the work, but by changing who or what does it. The system handles the low-judgment task. The owner's hours are freed. Those hours can go toward the high-judgment work that builds rather than the low-judgment work that maintains. The hustle doesn't grow faster because the owner is working more hours. It grows differently because the hours are now going toward the work that actually changes the ceiling rather than the work that hits it.
Before this continues, if you felt seen instead of sold to, that's the entire point of Relentless Wealth. Like the video, subscribe. We're just getting started. Systems are commonly understood as time-saving tools. Set up the automation, save the hours, do more with less. That framing is accurate, but it misses the more important economic effect. Systems don't just save time, they change the cost structure of the business. And a changed cost structure produces different economic properties, different relationships between revenue and cost that change what the business is capable of. In a hustle without systems, every unit of output has a variable cost. More output requires more time. More time costs more, whether in the owner's hours or in the hours of people paid to deliver. The cost structure is variable. It scales with the output, which means the margin stays roughly constant as the business grows. A system converts variable costs into fixed ones. The system is built once. The cost of building it is incurred once, or periodically as it's maintained and improved. After that, the system handles an expanding volume of output at roughly the same cost. The 10th use of the system costs the same as the first. The 100th use costs the same as the 10th. Revenue grows with volume. Cost stays roughly flat. Margin expands. This is the economic transformation systems produce, not just efficiency within the existing structure. A different structure, one where growth improves the economics rather than leaving them flat. Consider the difference concretely. A hustle owner who manually onboards every client spends 2 hours per client on onboarding. At 10 clients, 20 hours. At 20 clients, 40 hours. The cost scales linearly with the client count. The same owner who builds an automated onboarding system, a sequence of emails, a self-serve intake form, a recorded walkthrough of the process, spends those 2 hours once to build it. At 10 clients, roughly 2 hours total. At 20 clients, roughly 2 hours total. At 50 clients, roughly 2 hours total. The revenue from onboarding those clients scales with the count.
The cost of onboarding them doesn't. The margin on each client's onboarding improves as volume grows. The system produced a different economic relationship between volume and cost. This economic shift compounds over time. A hustle that systematizes its repetitive processes, one by one, over months and years, gradually converts its variable cost base into a fixed one. The business grows, the revenue grows, the costs grow more slowly, the margin expands. And the expanding margin funds the next layer of systematization, which expands the margin further, which funds the next layer. Systems compound the same way capital compounds. Each layer of systematization makes the next layer more accessible and more impactful. Most hustle owners understand that systems save time. Fewer understand that systems change economics. And the ones who understand the economic shift, who build systems not just to free hours, but to change the cost structure of what they're building, build something that scales differently from the hustle that stays manual. Not just bigger, more profitable per unit of output, more capable of sustaining growth without the owner's hours expanding proportionally. The time saved is the visible benefit. The economic transformation is the real one. The end state of systematization, if it's pursued deliberately enough, is an income profile that looks different from where it started. Not completely passive, that's rarely real, but partially decoupled. Some portion of the revenue arriving without the owner's active involvement in each specific transaction. And that partial decoupling, even when it's small, changes what the business structurally is. The income profile of a fully manual hustle is presence-dependent. Every dollar requires an action, a delivery, an hour, a decision, something the owner specifically did. The income profile of a systematized hustle is different. Some dollars arrive because of actions taken now. Some dollars arrive because of systems built and deployed earlier that are now running without continuous input. The marketing automation that nurtures leads while the owner sleeps. The onboarding sequence that converts new clients without manual follow-up. The delivery system that produces the output without the owner personally executing each step. Each of these generates revenue from infrastructure built earlier, not from hours invested now. The shift in income profile changes the owner's relationship with time. In a fully manual hustle, time off is revenue lost. Every hour not working is an hour not earning. In a partially automated hustle, some revenue continues during the hours the owner isn't working. Not all of it. The high judgment work still requires presence. The strategic decisions still require the owner. The relationships still require cultivation. But the portion of revenue that comes from systematized processes, from the infrastructure built to handle what doesn't require the owner specifically, arrives without the owner being there. And that portion represents the beginning of a structurally different income stream, one that compounds towards something the manual hustle could never become. The automation doesn't have to be complete to change the economics. A hustle that automates 20% of its processes hasn't automated itself. It's freed 20% of the owner's time. That time goes back into the business, into the high judgment work, into building the next layer of systematization, into acquiring the next client or developing the next product. And the next layer of automation frees more time, which funds more building, which produces more automation. The process is slow, but it's directional. Each layer moves the income profile further from full presence dependence and closer to something that runs without requiring the owner for every dollar it generates. Most hustle owners never reach this point, not because it's inaccessible, because the urgency of the current work always crowds out the building of the next layer. There's always a client to serve, always a deliverable due, always something that needs the owner's attention right now, that feels more pressing than setting up the system that would eventually make right now easier. The manual hustle creates the conditions that prevent it from becoming anything else. Breaking that pattern requires a deliberate decision to invest time in systems, not when it's convenient, because it's never convenient, but as a protected priority alongside the delivery work that keeps the income flowing. The owner who does both, who delivers today and builds the system for tomorrow, ends up somewhere different from the one who only delivers. Subscribe if this is the kind of thinking you want more of. Like this if something shifted.
Most side hustles are built on a simple structure. You have a skill. Someone needs that skill. They pay you for your time. It's familiar. It's the same structure as employment, just applied outside a primary job, just applied to a different client or a different platform or a different context. And it works. It generates income. It's real money coming from somewhere other than the main job. But it has a ceiling, built into the structure itself, before the first client is found, before the first dollar is earned. The ceiling is time. The structure trades hours for income, your hours, your direct effort, your presence in the work, which means the maximum the hustle can produce is determined by how many hours you can give it, and what each of those hours is worth. You can increase the rate per hour, better positioning, better clients, higher value work. You can increase the hours, more evenings, more weekends, less recovery. But both levers have limits. The rate has a ceiling determined by what the market supports. The hours have a ceiling determined by what the human body can sustain on top of a primary job. And somewhere between those two ceilings, the hustle reaches its maximum. Not through failure, through the structural limits of a model built on trading time. This is the distinction that matters. A hustle is a second job. It requires your presence to produce. It stops when you stop. It scales only as far as your hours scale. A business is something different. Not because of the legal structure, not because of the name or the branding or the complexity of the operation, but because of the relationship between the owner's time and the business's output. A business produces when the owner isn't directly producing. It generates revenue from systems, from processes, from other people's effort, from assets that work without the owner's continuous presence. That structural difference between presence-dependent and presence-independent output is what separates the hustle from the business. Most people who start side hustles never make that transition. Not because they aren't capable, not because the market doesn't exist, not because the idea isn't good enough. Because the structure they built was always a second job, and the work they put in made the second job busier, but didn't change what it structurally was. More clients, more hours, more income, same ceiling. The income grew within the structure, but the structure itself never changed, which means the ceiling never changed, which means the hustle never became something that could grow beyond the owner. The question that separates the two isn't how much money it makes. It isn't how many clients it has. It isn't how recognized the brand is. It's one structural question.
Does this produce when I'm not working on it? If the answer is no, it's a second job, a valuable one, a well-paying one, but a second job. If the answer is beginning to be yes, even partially, even in a small way, the structure has started to shift. And that shift, from presence-dependent to presence-independent output, is where the business actually begins.
If this feels familiar, if you've felt this pressure but never had words for it, this channel isn't here to motivate you. It's here to help you see clearly. If that resonates, like the video. Subscribe. More clarity is coming. Scalability is a word used loosely in most conversations about business. Everything sounds scalable in a pitch. Every idea sounds like it could be bigger. Every hustle sounds like it could become something more than it currently is. But scalability isn't a quality of an idea. It's a structural property of how the business operates. And building the structural property deliberately, intentionally designing the output to become less dependent on the owner's hours, is the work that most hustle owners never do. The side hustles that grow into businesses share one structural characteristic. Their output is not directly proportional to the hours the owner puts in. Not because the owner stops working, but because the work shifts. From doing the deliverable, the writing, the design, the service, the product, to building the system that produces the deliverable without the owner's direct involvement in each instance. The owner's time moves up a level, from production to architecture, from doing to designing what gets done. And the architecture, the system, the process, the team, the tool, does the production that the owner used to do personally. What does that actually look like in practice? It looks like a service that gets productized. Instead of custom work delivered differently for each client, a standardized package. Same deliverable, same process, same outcome, delivered at scale without requiring different decisions for each new engagement. The productization removes the custom cognitive work from each delivery, and custom cognitive work is what keeps most services tied to the owner's direct involvement. Remove the customization, or systematize it, and the delivery becomes something that can be templated, delegated, or automated. It looks like delegation. The owner identifies which parts of the work require their specific judgment and capability, and which parts are execution that someone else could perform given the right system and instruction. The parts that require specific judgment, the owner keeps. The parts that are execution, the owner systematizes and delegates. This transition is uncomfortable because it requires trusting others to do what the owner knows how to do. And it requires accepting that the delegated work won't be done exactly as the owner would do it. But the owner who does everything themselves has not built a business. They've built the most constrained version of a second job, one where every task requires their specific presence. It looks like assets that produce repeatedly, content created once and accessed many times, systems built once that process many transactions, tools built once that serve many users, knowledge packaged once and sold many times. Each of these is a form of leverage. The owner's time went in once. The output comes out repeatedly, without the same input being required each time. That leverage is the structural property that makes scale possible. And building that leverage deliberately, choosing how the hustle's output gets structured so that it requires less of the owner's time per unit of output over time, is the actual work of transitioning from a hustle to a business. It doesn't happen automatically. It requires a deliberate decision to stop optimizing the current structure
and start building a different one.
The transition from hustle to business doesn't happen in a moment. There's no single decision that converts one into the other, no threshold crossed, no point where the hustle is suddenly a business. It happens through a series of structural decisions made over time, each one moving the operation slightly further from the owner's hours and slightly closer to something that can produce without them. The first structural decision is about what the owner stops doing. Most hustle owners are doers. They built the hustle by doing, by being the person who delivers the work. The transition requires deciding what the owner stops doing personally, not because those things don't need to be done, because the owner doing them personally is the structural constraint that keeps the ceiling in place. Every task the owner does personally is a task that can't happen beyond the owner's available hours. Every task that gets systematized or delegated is a task that can happen at a scale beyond the owner's hours. The transition starts with identifying the tasks that keep the owner in production and making a deliberate decision to stop being the person who does them. The second structural decision is about pricing. Most hustles are priced for the owner's time. What can I charge per hour? What does the market pay for my category of service? Business pricing is different. It's priced on the value delivered, not on the time required. A business that charges for time keeps the owner's time in the equation. Every unit of revenue requires a unit of time. A business that charges for value, for the outcome the client receives, breaks the link between time and revenue. The same outcome, delivered in 1 hour through a systematized process, commands the same price as it did when it took 5 hours of custom work. And the margin on that difference, the time saved through systematization, is what funds the next layer of building. The third structural decision is about positioning. Most hustles compete on availability and price. I'm available, I'm reasonably priced, I'll do good work. That positioning keeps the hustle in competition with every other available provider, which keeps pricing competitive, which keeps margins thin, which keeps the owner doing the work personally because there's no margin to fund delegation. Business positioning is different. It's specific. It targets a narrow market. It solves a specific problem for a specific type of client. It commands a premium because it's positioned as the right answer to a specific question, not as a generic available option. The premium created by positioning funds the systems, funds the delegation, funds the transition from doing to building. These three decisions, what the owner stops doing, how the work is priced, how the business is positioned, don't produce a business overnight. They produce a different trajectory. A hustle following the same trajectory gets bigger, but stays a second job. A hustle that makes these structural decisions starts to produce differently, starts to require less of the owner per dollar earned, starts to develop systems and positioning that compound into something the owner's hours alone never could have produced. The transition isn't about working harder. It's about working on the structure, the pricing, the positioning, the systems, rather than continuing to work inside the structure that was always going to cap at the same ceiling. If this shifted something for you, subscribe. Like this if it clarified something. Most people approach the side hustle decision the way they approach most decisions about things they haven't done before. They look for what seems accessible, what other people are doing, what appears to be working right now, what feels like a reasonable place to start. And they start there, without examining what that starting point means for where they can go.
Because the first decision isn't just the first decision. It's the structural foundation on which everything that follows gets built. The market entered, the skills deployed, the model chosen. All of it compounds forward in the same direction from the moment the decision is made. The compounding works in both directions. A side hustle started in the right market, one with real demand, reasonable margins, and a clear path to differentiation, compounds toward a real income stream. Each client adds credibility. Each delivery improves the process. Each dollar of revenue funds the next layer of building. A side hustle started in the wrong market, oversaturated, underpaying, with no path to differentiation, compounds toward a ceiling that never gets higher. More effort, more hours, the same structural result. Because the market was always the constraint, not the execution inside it. The specific elements of the first decision that determine the trajectory are three: market selection, skill alignment, model structure. Market selection determines who the potential customers are, how many of them exist, what they will pay, and how crowded the competitive landscape is. Skill alignment determines how quickly real value can be delivered, which determines how quickly the hustle generates income and how credibly it can compete. Model structure determines whether the hustle has a ceiling built into it from the start, or whether it's structured in a way that can evolve towards something scalable. Most people examine none of these before starting. They see something working for someone else. They identify a platform or a format. They start producing. And they discover, months later, that the market is oversaturated, that the rate it pays doesn't justify the effort, that the model they chose requires their presence for every dollar it generates. Not because they weren't capable, because the structural analysis wasn't done before the commitment was made. The first decision set the trajectory, and the trajectory was already pointing toward a ceiling before the first hour of work was done. This doesn't mean the first decision has to be perfect. It rarely is. Markets are discovered through participation. Skill fits are discovered through delivery. Model limitations are discovered through operation. But the investor who examines the structure of what they're entering, even imperfectly, even with limited information, makes a better first decision than the one who doesn't examine it at all. And a better first decision starts the compounding in a direction that produces more over the same period of time with the same effort. The decision is the leverage point. Everything after it is execution inside the structure it created. Every few years, a new category of side hustle gets significant attention. A format that's working, a platform that's paying well, a model that seems to produce disproportionate returns for the people doing it. And a wave of people enters that category, drawn by the visibility of the results, by the content documenting those results, by the apparent accessibility of something that's clearly working for people who don't seem dramatically different from themselves. This is the trend cycle, and it consistently produces the wrong starting point for the people who follow it. The reason comes down to timing. The people generating the results that attract attention to a category are almost always the early participants. They entered the market when the competition was thin, when the platform was actively promoting new participants, when the early mover advantage was producing returns that reflected scarcity, not capability. By the time the results are visible enough to attract a wave of followers, by the time the content documenting those results has been seen widely enough to change behavior, the market has changed. More participants have entered. The platform has shifted its algorithm. The early mover advantage has eroded. The returns available to new entrants are lower than the returns that attracted them in the first place. The trend follower enters at the wrong point in the cycle, not at the beginning, when scarcity produced outsized returns. At the peak, when visibility is highest, competition is most intense, and the returns available are the lowest they've been since the category emerged. This pattern repeats across every category of side hustle that has gone through a trend cycle. Dropshipping, print on demand, YouTube, podcasting, newsletter writing, short-form video. Each category went through a period where early participants generated returns that seemed extraordinary. Each category attracted followers at the point where those returns were no longer accessible to new entrants in the same way. The structural problem with trend following isn't that these categories don't work. They do work. People build real businesses in all of them. The problem is that trend following puts new entrants in competition with established participants who have more content, more audience, more trust, and who built those assets during the period when the market rewarded early participation. The new entrant is competing against people who had a structural head start, and doing so in a market that is more crowded than it was when that head start was built. The odds aren't impossible, but they're significantly worse than they were for the people whose results attracted the entrant in the first place. The alternative isn't avoiding new categories. It's selecting based on structural fit, not on what's generating attention right now. A category entered early, before the trend cycle peaks, because it aligns with existing skills and addresses real unsolved demand, produces different outcomes than a category entered late because the results looked compelling. The former is a structural decision. The latter is a reactive one. And reactive decisions, made in response to what's visible now, almost always arrive after the structural advantage has already been captured by the people who decided earlier. If this made sense to you, you already understand more than most people do. This channel exists for that kind of awareness. Like the video, subscribe. Nothing here is accidental. Most people approaching a side hustle look outward for the answer. What's working in the market? What skills are in demand? What categories seem to be producing results for people who look like them? And they overlook the most obvious starting point: what they already know. The fastest path to a viable side income runs through existing expertise. Not because new skills can't be learned, not because unfamiliar categories can't be entered, but because existing expertise solves the hardest problem in the early stage of any side hustle: credibility. The earliest stage of building a side income requires convincing someone, a client, a customer, a buyer, to pay for something from someone with no track record. Existing expertise dramatically shortens the credibility building period. A person with 10 years of experience in a specific domain already has the knowledge, the vocabulary, the judgment, and the pattern recognition that a buyer in that domain will pay for. Most people underestimate the market value of what they already know, because expertise is invisible from the inside. What feels routine to a professional who has spent years developing a specific capability is genuinely valuable to someone who doesn't have it. The accountant who has navigated a specific type of tax situation 100 times has knowledge that most small business owners would pay meaningfully for. The project manager who has built complex cross-functional processes has a framework that consultants sell. The HR professional who knows how to structure a hiring process has knowledge that founders consistently get wrong and pay for help with. In each case, the knowledge exists. The market for it exists. What doesn't exist yet is the structure that connects the two. Building that structure is the actual work of starting, not learning something new, not entering an unfamiliar market, not acquiring skills the hustle requires. packaging what already exists in a form the market can access and pay for. A service offering built around the existing expertise, a productized version of what the professional already does, a course or framework that teaches what the professional already knows. The starting point is already there. Most people walk past it on their way to looking for something else. The reason existing expertise gets overlooked is familiarity. What you know feels ordinary to you. It doesn't feel like something worth paying for. Because you've known it so long, it no longer registers as unusual. But value isn't determined by how familiar something is to the provider. It's determined by how valuable it is to the buyer. And the buyer, the small business owner, the entrepreneur, the professional in a different field, doesn't have what you have. What feels routine to you is a genuine gap for them, and people pay to close genuine gaps. The most underutilized asset in most side hustle decisions is the expertise the person already has, already owns, already spent years building, and consistently walks past on the way to finding something new. Two people, same skills, same work ethic, same hours invested, different markets. After 2 years, they're in completely different positions, not because one worked harder, not because one was more capable, because the market one entered was structured differently from the other. And market structure compounds forward from the first day in exactly the same way that any other compounding mechanism does. Markets differ across several structural dimensions. Size. How many potential buyers exist? How large is the pool of people who have the problem the hustle solves? Willingness to pay. Not just whether the problem exists, but whether the people who have it are accustomed to paying for solutions. A market full of people with a genuine problem who have never paid for a solution and don't expect to is a structurally different market from one where paying for solutions is standard practice. Competition. How many other providers are offering roughly the same solution? How established they are? How hard it is to differentiate? The willingness to pay dimension is the one most commonly underestimated. Most side hustle selection is based on whether the problem is real, not on whether the market is conditioned to pay. A problem is real if people genuinely experience it. A market pays if people are accustomed to exchanging money for solutions to that problem. These are different things, and the gap between them is where many hustles fail. A side hustle serving a market that has the problem but not the payment habit spends most of its time educating the market about paying rather than delivering the solution. A side hustle serving a market where payment for this type of solution is standard spends its time competing on quality and positioning, not on convincing people that paying is appropriate. The second market is structurally easier to operate in, even if the first market is larger. Competition density matters for the same compounding reason. A less competitive market allows differentiation to happen faster. The hustle doesn't need to be exceptional. It needs to be clearly better than the alternatives. In a crowded market, where many providers are offering similar things, differentiation requires being significantly better, or significantly cheaper, or occupying a specific niche narrow enough to escape the competition. All of which takes longer, costs more, produces results more slowly. The same capability that would be the obvious choice in a less competitive market becomes one option among many in an oversaturated one. Market selection isn't the only variable. Execution matters. Skills matter. Positioning matters. But market selection is the structural foundation on which everything else operates. The best execution in the wrong market produces worse results than adequate execution in the right one. because the market determines what's possible, not just what's accessible. And the hustle owner who selects the market deliberately, who asks not just what they can do, but where what they can do is most valued, most needed, and most paid for, starts the compounding in a direction that the trend follower or the familiarity-driven selector almost never reaches from the same effort. If this landed differently than you expected, subscribe. Like this if it reframed something. When a side hustle fails, the explanation that gets offered is almost always about the idea. The market wasn't there. The timing was wrong. The competition was too established. The concept didn't resonate. These explanations are rarely wrong, but they're rarely the full story. Because most side hustle failures aren't caused by bad ideas. They're caused by structural problems that were present from the beginning, that would have been visible to someone examining the structure rather than just the concept. The structural failure points that end most side hustles in year one fall into three categories: undercapitalization, wrong pricing, quitting too early. Each of these is structural. Each of them compounds, and each of them is more predictable and more preventable than the idea-based explanation most people reach for after the fact. Undercapitalization is the most common, not the most discussed, but the most common. Most side hustles require time to generate income, time to build an audience, time to develop credibility, time to close the first client, time to iterate toward what the market actually responds to. And most side hustle owners who started without examining the runway run out of that time before they reach the point where the hustle would have worked. Not because the hustle was wrong, because the financial and temporal runway was too short to reach the validation point. Wrong pricing compounds differently. Pricing decisions made in the early stage don't just affect early revenue. They establish the market's perception of what the hustle is worth. A hustle priced too low attracts price-sensitive clients who are the hardest to retain, the most demanding relative to the revenue they generate, and the most resistant to price increases later. A hustle priced too low also signals low value to the market, making it harder to raise prices later without losing the client base built at the lower price. The early pricing decision shapes the trajectory of the business far beyond the first few months it takes effect. Quitting too early is the failure point most people never see coming. Because from the inside, at the moment of quitting, it doesn't feel like quitting too early. It feels like making the rational decision based on the available evidence. The evidence says months of effort, limited results, no clear sign that this is about to change. What the evidence doesn't show, because it hasn't happened yet, is the inflection point that was approaching, the moment where the audience would have reached critical mass, where the next client would have come from a referral rather than cold outreach, where the process would have clicked into something that started to work reliably. Most hustles that get abandoned in year one weren't bad ideas. They were abandoned before the compounding had time to produce the evidence that would have justified continuing. A side hustle requires runway. Not just financial runway, though that matters. Temporal runway. The time available to reach the point where the hustle generates enough to sustain continued operation. And most side hustle owners underestimate how much runway is required and start without enough of either. The timeline of a typical side hustle doesn't match most people's expectations. Month 1. The hustle is started, infrastructure built, offering defined, first outreach made. Month 2. First potential clients identified, first conversations had, first rejections received. Month 3. Maybe a first client, maybe not yet. Iteration happening. the offering being refined based on what the market is actually responding to. Month 6. A clearer picture. Repeat clients or consistent new ones. The process starting to develop muscle memory. The results starting to look like something. Month 12. The hustle has a track record, some credibility, some proof that the model works, a foundation to build from. Most people who start side hustles expect results in month 1 or 2, not month 12. Which means when month 3 arrives and the results don't match the expectation, the response is to question the idea, not the timeline. Was this the wrong concept? Is the market not there? Should I try something different? And the hustle gets abandoned, or pivoted away from, at month 3 or 4, before it had the time it needed to reach the point where it would have worked. The financial dimension of undercapitalization compounds the temporal one. A side hustle that requires investment in tools, in advertising, in infrastructure needs capital to operate before it generates capital. Most side hustle owners either underestimate these costs or have no clear plan for how to fund the early stage, which means when unexpected costs arrive, a tool more expensive than anticipated, an advertising test that didn't convert, the financial pressure compounds the psychological pressure of slow early results. And the combination, financial strain plus slow results, produces the rational feeling decision to quit that is structurally premature. The solution isn't complicated, but it requires a decision before the hustle starts, not after it's struggling. Define the runway. How long will I give this before making a judgment about its viability? Define the capital. What does it cost to operate during that runway period? Is that capital available? Define the validation criteria. What would I need to see, at what point, to conclude the idea isn't working versus conclude the timeline hasn't been honored? These questions don't guarantee success, but they replace the emotional decision made under pressure, the month 4 abandonment of something that needed month 12, with a structural commitment made in clarity. And structural commitments made in clarity produce better decisions than emotional ones made under strain.
If this feels familiar, if you've felt this pressure but never had words for it, this channel isn't here to motivate you. It's here to help you see clearly. If that resonates, like the video. Subscribe. More clarity is coming. Pricing is one of the most consequential decisions in the early stage of a side hustle, and one of the most commonly gotten wrong. Not because the math is complicated, because the psychology of pricing in an early stage, when there's no track record, no social proof, no existing client base, pushes almost everyone toward a price lower than the one they should set. The underpricing instinct comes from a specific fear. If I charge what I think it's worth, nobody will pay. If I charge less, at least I'll get clients. At least I'll start generating revenue. At least I'll have something to build from. This logic isn't irrational. In the very earliest stage, before there's any validation, getting the first client matters more than getting the right price. But the underpricing instinct persists well past the point where it's appropriate. It becomes the default, not a temporary early-stage choice, and it creates structural problems that compound forward. The first structural problem is client quality. Low pricing attracts price-sensitive clients. Price-sensitive clients are the most demanding relative to the revenue they generate. They negotiate harder. They scope creep more. They're more likely to request revisions. They're more likely to churn when a cheaper option appears. A client base built at low prices is a client base that maximizes the owner's workload while minimizing the margin available to invest in improvement and growth.
The hustle becomes busier with the wrong clients, leaving less capacity to develop the product, improve the process, or attract better ones. The second structural problem is market signaling. Price is information. It signals to the market what the hustle believes it's worth, what category it belongs to, what kind of client it's designed to serve. A low price signals a low value option, not necessarily intentionally, but consistently, because buyers use price as a proxy for quality when they don't have other information. The hustle priced low is competing on price against every other low-priced option in the category. The hustle priced higher, with credible positioning to support the price, is competing on value against a smaller, less price-sensitive market that is easier to retain and more likely to refer. Raising prices later is harder than setting them right earlier. A client base accustomed to low prices will resist an increase. Some will leave. The transition period is uncomfortable and often generates the kind of short-term revenue loss that feels like confirmation the higher price was wrong. It usually isn't. The client loss is often the loss of the clients who were costing more to serve than they were worth. But the psychological pressure of watching clients leave during a price increase, especially in the early stage, pushes many hustle owners back to the lower price, which locks them into the margin, the client profile, and the market positioning of the underpriced model. The early pricing decision wasn't just about early revenue. It was a structural decision about what the hustle would become and whether it would ever be viable at the margins required to sustain it. There's a specific moment in the timeline of most side hustles that isn't visible on any graph. It doesn't show up in the revenue numbers. It doesn't appear in the client count. It isn't marked by any external signal. But it exists. The inflection point. The moment where the compounding that has been building invisibly would have started to become visible if the hustle had continued past it. Compounding in a side hustle works the same way it works in a portfolio. The early returns are small, almost invisible relative to the effort invested. The content published doesn't get much traction. The outreach generates few responses. The early clients don't refer consistently. The reputation being built doesn't feel like it's building. This is normal, not a signal that something is wrong, not evidence that the idea doesn't work. It's the early stage of compounding, where the inputs are real and the outputs are small, because the base hasn't built enough yet to produce the returns that will eventually justify the inputs. The problem is that the early stage looks identical to failure. From the inside, at month 4 or month 6, the experience of a hustle that is compounding towards something is the same as the experience of one that isn't. Slow results, inconsistent income, more effort than output, uncertainty about whether this is going to work. And the natural response to that experience, the rational feeling response, is to conclude that it isn't working and to stop, which is precisely what most people do, at precisely the moment where the compounding would have started to become visible. The people who build successful side hustles aren't usually the ones who figured it out faster. They're the ones who stayed in it longer, who honored the runway they'd committed to, who continued when the results didn't justify the effort by month 4, who treated the early stage as what it structurally was, an investment period, rather than as evidence of failure. Not because they were more disciplined, because they had a framework that distinguished between a hustle that isn't working and a hustle that hasn't had time to compound. Those are different things, and treating them as the same thing is the most common cause of year 1 abandonment of something that would have worked. The framework for knowing the difference isn't complicated. Is the market responding at all, even modestly, even inconsistently? Are the early clients satisfied with what they received? Is the process improving? Is each delivery better than the last? Is there evidence, however small, that the audience is growing, the credibility is accumulating, the referrals are starting to happen? If the answers are yes, even partially, the hustle is compounding, slowly, in the early stage, producing returns that don't yet match the inputs. That's not failure. That's the early stage of something that takes time to build. And the hustle owner who understands that distinction, who stays through the early stage that looks like failure, is the one who reaches the inflection point that most people quit just before. If you've been sitting with something wondering whether to keep going, subscribe and like this if it clarified something. Service businesses and product businesses look similar from the outside. Both generate revenue, both serve customers, both require work to build and maintain. But they operate on fundamentally different economics, different relationships between the owner's time and the output, different scaling properties, different ceilings. And the difference isn't about which is better, it's about what each one actually is, structurally, and what that structure means for how far it can grow and what it costs to get there. A service business sells expertise and time. The client pays for access to a person's knowledge, skill, and effort, applied to a specific problem over a specific period. The value delivered exists only through the delivery. The lawyer who doesn't show up hasn't delivered the legal service. The consultant who doesn't analyze hasn't delivered the insight. The designer who doesn't create hasn't delivered the design. The service is inseparable from the act of delivering it, which means the service business is fundamentally tied to human presence and capacity. More revenue requires more capacity. More capacity requires more people. And more people require management, coordination, quality control, all of which consume more of the owner's time, even as they're meant to reduce it. A product business operates differently. The product exists independent of the seller. It was created once. It sits on a shelf, physical or digital. It can be sold again and again without the creator being present for each transaction. The economics of this are structurally different from the service model. The cost of creating the product is incurred once, or periodically. The cost of selling the next unit is marginal, or zero, which means revenue can scale without a proportional increase in the owner's time or the business's costs. 1,000 units sold doesn't require 1,000 hours of the owner's presence. It requires the product to exist and a mechanism to deliver it. These structural differences produce different financial profiles. Service businesses typically have high revenue per transaction because each transaction involves significant human effort. But they also have high cost of delivery because that human effort is the primary input. Margins can be strong, but they require managing capacity carefully. And growth requires adding capacity, people, time, expertise, which is expensive and complex. Product businesses typically have lower revenue per transaction, but potentially much higher margins at scale, because the cost of the product doesn't increase proportionally with the number of units sold. A software product sold to 10,000 users costs roughly the same to maintain as one sold to 1,000 users, but generates 10 times the revenue. Most people who start businesses start service businesses, not because they've thought through the economics, but because a service business is the most accessible entry point. You have a skill. Someone will pay for it. You start selling the skill. And the service business begins with all of its structural properties, including the ceiling, without the owner necessarily understanding what they've built or what it will cost to change it later. Understanding the structural difference between service and product economics doesn't mean avoiding service businesses. It means knowing what you're building and making deliberate decisions about how to change the structure over time.
Every service business has a ceiling. Not a ceiling determined by the market, not a ceiling determined by the owner's capability, a ceiling determined by the structure of the model itself. And understanding that ceiling, precisely, structurally, is what allows a service business owner to build deliberately towards something different. The ceiling exists because of capacity. Revenue in a service business is a function of how many hours of service can be delivered in a given period, and what each hour commands in the market. Both variables have limits. The rate per hour is limited by what the market will pay for the specific service and expertise. It can be raised through better positioning, higher value clients, specialization, but it has a ceiling determined by market dynamics. The hours are limited by the number of people delivering the service, and the number of hours each can sustain. For a solo service business, the ceiling is the owner's hours multiplied by their rate. For a service business with employees, the ceiling expands with each person added. But so does the complexity, the management overhead, the quality control requirement, the coordination cost. Adding people is the standard solution to the service ceiling, and it works to a point. A law firm grows by adding lawyers. A consulting firm grows by adding consultants. An agency grows by adding specialists. But adding people creates a different constraint. The business that scales through headcount isn't escaping the time for money model. It's replicating it across more people. The owner's personal time ceiling expands because others are now delivering the service. But the business's ceiling is now determined by the aggregate of those people's hours and by the owner's capacity to manage them. At some point, the management of the people consumes the owner's time as much as the service delivery did, and the business is now constrained by the owner's ability to manage capacity, not their ability to deliver service. A different ceiling, but still a ceiling. The margin structure creates a second problem. In most service businesses, the primary cost is people. Labor is the input, revenue is the output. The difference between them is the margin. And as the business grows, as more people are added to deliver more service, the ratio between labor cost and revenue often stays roughly constant, or worsens, as management overhead is added, as the coordination cost of a larger team consumes resources that don't directly generate revenue. The business earns more in absolute terms, but the margin per unit of output, per hour of service delivered, doesn't improve substantially, which means the ceiling on profitability scales with the ceiling on capacity, but the ratio between them doesn't change as dramatically as the revenue does. This is the fundamental tension of the service model at scale. It can grow, but the growth requires proportional investment in the capacity that delivers it. Unlike a product business, where the next unit of revenue costs incrementally less to produce than the last, the service business requires roughly the same investment per unit of revenue, regardless of how big it gets. Not always, not without exception, but structurally. And the businesses that escape this constraint, the service businesses that achieve disproportionate revenue relative to their labor cost, do so by changing the structure, by introducing elements that break the link between time and revenue. That's not easy, but it's the direction that turns a service business ceiling into something higher. Pause for a second. If you're still listening, it's probably because this didn't feel exaggerated. That's intentional. If this way of thinking matters to you, like the video, subscribe. We'll keep going deeper. The service businesses that scale past the time constraint don't do so by working harder, or by adding more people faster, or by charging more per hour. They do so by changing the structure, by deliberately introducing elements that break the link between time delivered and revenue generated. That structural change doesn't happen automatically. It requires deliberate decisions about how the service gets packaged, priced, and delivered. The first structural move is productization. A productized service takes what was custom work, done differently for each client, and converts it into a standardized offering. Same deliverable, same process, same outcome, delivered repeatedly without custom decisions for each engagement. Productization removes the cognitive work from each delivery, and the cognitive work, the thinking, the customization, the judgment, is what makes service delivery time-intensive. Remove the customization, or systematize it, and the delivery becomes templatable, delegatable, potentially automatable. The service still gets delivered, but the delivery requires less of the owner's specific presence for each instance. The second structural move is separating pricing from time. Most service businesses price by the hour or by the project, which ties revenue directly to time. More time, more revenue. Less time, less revenue. Value-based pricing breaks that link. The price reflects the outcome the client receives, not the time required to produce it. A tax strategy that saves a client $200,000 is worth a significant fee, regardless of whether it took 20 hours or 2 hours. The client is paying for the outcome. The time is the owner's internal cost to produce it. As the owner systematizes the delivery, as the process becomes faster through repetition and tooling, the same outcome gets produced in less time. The revenue stays constant, the margin expands, and the margin funds the next layer of systematization, which reduces the time further, which expands the margin further. The third structural move is leverage through other people or technology. Not just hiring, leverage. There's a difference between hiring people to do what the owner used to do, which replicates the time for money model at scale, and structuring the business so that other people or technology multiply the owner's output. A consultant who builds a methodology and licenses it, teaches it, or certifies others to deliver it has created leverage. Their thinking now generates revenue through other people's delivery, without their direct presence in each engagement. A service business that builds software tools to automate part of its delivery has created leverage. The tool does in minutes what used to take hours. The revenue stays constant, the cost falls. In both cases, the owner's time is no longer the primary constraint on revenue. Something else is doing the scaling work. These structural moves don't eliminate the service business, they evolve it. The business still delivers service, still has clients, still requires expertise and execution. But the relationship between the owner's hours and the revenue becomes less direct, less proportional, less constrained by the ceiling that the original service model imposed. And the business that evolves this way doesn't just earn more. It builds a different kind of asset, one that doesn't require the owner's continuous presence to sustain itself, one that produces with less input per dollar of output, one that is, structurally, closer to a business than to an extended second job. The decision between service and product isn't binary. Most successful businesses contain elements of both. They deliver service, because service is where trust gets built, where deep client relationships develop, where the specific expertise that differentiates the business gets applied. And they build product, because product is where leverage lives,
where revenue grows beyond the owner's hours, where the business develops assets that produce without continuous input. The question isn't which model to choose, it's how to combine them deliberately, and when to introduce the product elements that change the economics. Most businesses start as pure service. That's not wrong. Service is where expertise gets validated, where the market tells you what it will pay for what you know, where the specific problems you're best positioned to solve reveal themselves. The early service phase is information gathering as much as it is revenue generation. What do clients consistently need? What part of the delivery is most valuable? What problems come up repeatedly that you're solving from scratch each time? The answers to those questions are the raw material for the product layer that comes later. The repeated problems become the standardized solution. The repeated delivery becomes the productized offer. The repeated knowledge becomes the course, the tool, the framework. The timing of the transition matters. Introducing product elements too early, before the service has validated what the market actually needs, produces products that miss the market. Introducing them too late, after the service ceiling has become a source of frustration rather than a feature, leaves years of potential leverage uncaptured. The right moment is when the patterns are clear, when the service has repeated enough to reveal what's consistent, what clients always need, what the delivery always requires, what the expertise always produces. That consistency is the signal. The product layer is the response to it. The product layer doesn't have to be large to change the economics. A small, productized offering, a standardized package, a template sold once and reused, a tool built for internal use that can be sold externally, changes the relationship between the owner's time and the business's revenue, even modestly, even at a fraction of total revenue. Because once some revenue is coming from something that doesn't require hours to produce, the economics of the business are different. Not dramatically yet, but structurally. And structural differences compound over time. The product layer that represents 5% of revenue today can represent 50% in 5 years, as the service systematizes and the product scales. Understanding the economics of both models, their structural properties, their ceilings, the specific moves that change them, is what allows a service business owner to build deliberately towards something that doesn't cap at their hours. Not by abandoning the service, by evolving the structure around it. Adding product where the service reveals the opportunity. Adding leverage where the delivery reveals the pattern. Adding systems where the operations reveal the repetition. The business that results isn't a pure service business anymore, and it isn't a pure product business either. It's something that compounds, that produces beyond the owner's hours, that builds position rather than just converting time into income. If this shifted something for you, subscribe. Like this if it clarified something.